you all for attending tonight, and thank you to the Newport Historical Society for inviting me to speak. Tonight I'll be discussing Loyalist women in 18th century Newport. This work stems from my time as one of Newport Historical Society's Buchanan Burnham Summer Scholars in Public History in 2019. I was fortunate to be part of a very lovely cohort and had an amazing experience with the Newport Historical Society. During my time, I was able to work with and learn from NHS's wonderful staff and use their rich library and archive to conduct independent research. And I do believe applications are open for this coming summer, so if you're a graduate student, I highly recommend applying. My fellowship research centered around Loyalist women in Newport and from the American Revolutionary era. I came in with many questions. Who were Newport Loyalist women? How many were there? What happened to them? Where did they go? How did they feel? I wasn't sure how much I would be able to find, but as you'll hear tonight, it was very fruitful research. From my findings, I was able to write a journal article, and that was published in NHS's Newport History, and I will be discussing the subject of that article tonight. However, before I dive too deep into my research in Newport, I want to take a step back. I'd like to begin by asking you to all mentally answer, what do you think of when you think of the American Revolution? Perhaps you think of the Freedom Trail in Boston or George Washington or even a certain New England football team. You may think of Lexington and Concord or the Declaration of Independence. Most likely you think about the Patriot side of the war. Naturally, this is the viewpoint that most Americans are taught in school and the perspective that is often shared at American historic sites. There is a national narrative about how the American colonists rose up to defeat a global superpower and created a republic built on ideals such as liberty and equality. Now think to yourself, what do you think of when you think of Loyalists? Perhaps you think of the tarring and feathering of tax collectors or Benedict Arnold's great betrayal. You might associate Loyalists with wealthy elites or perhaps consider them cowards or people who are indifferent to the injustices that the Patriots were fighting against. Or perhaps you have never given them much thought at all. Hopefully, over the course of my talk, you will gain a deeper understanding of Loyalists and their experiences to gain a more nuanced view of the American Revolution. Historically, there are three prevailing views of Loyalists. They were largely ignored in British history, celebrated as the founders of Anglo-Canada, and typically belittled or overlooked in American history. In regards to historians studying Loyalists, there have been several resurgences in academic interest surrounding Loyalism. One such resurgence was fueled by the 1976 bicentennial, with work from scholars such as Mary Beth Norton, Bernard Balin, and Robert Calhoun. Attention then waned, however, the 21st century has seen a revival of Loyalist scholarship, starting around 2010 with new books like The Consequences of Loyalism, The Loyal Atlantic, and Liberty's Exiles. Liberty's Exiles in particular is a wonderful book on the global diaspora of Loyalists, and if anyone wants further general reading on Loyalists, I would highly recommend that. One important aspect to remember is that not all American colonists were patriots. It is estimated between 15 to 33% of the population were loyalists, although that number is probably closer to 20%. And many people opted to remain neutral during the war. It was not inevitable, nor did the majority of people actively choose to revolt against Great Britain. After the war, over 60,000 loyalists left the United States and moved to various parts of the British Empire, including British North America, or modern-day Canada, England, the Caribbean, Sierra Leone, and even a few to India. However, not all loyalists left, and some opted to remain in the new United States, although that percentage of how many remained is unclear. So what did it mean to be a loyalist? The definition of a loyalist or Tory is complex, as the first definitions were created by the victors of the American Revolution, the Patriots. For example, Thomas Paine in his 1776 work, The Crisis, stated, "Every Tory is a coward, for servile, slavish, self-interested fear is the foundation of Toryism. And a man under such influence, though he may be cruel, never can be brave." Naturally, the Patriots, as the enemies of the Loyalists, portrayed them as selfish, elitist, or cowardly. However, Loyalists were much more complicated than that. Yes, there were those associated with the British side of the war, but Loyalists opposed revolting from England for numerous reasons, including religious, emotional, economic, and political motives. Many identified with their local communities and often resented imposed taxes like their patriot neighbors. Defining a Loyalist woman is even more complicated. Thomas Paine's definition of a Loyalist, which can be seen on the screen and that I mentioned earlier, refers to a man. 18th century colonial society did not view women as political beings, and they were often associated with their husbands' political opinions. 18th century women did not vote, fight, or legislate. So how can we know their political affiliation? Some women were active in showing their support through a variety of activities, including letter writing, keeping journals, supporting the British economy, delivering intelligence to the British, and resisting patriot decrees. However, women were often labeled as loyalists merely because male family members were known loyalists, or because they chose to flee previously British-occupied cities and live with other loyalist exiles. It is difficult to truly know whether all women deemed to be loyalists supported the British side of the war. However, even if a woman did not consider herself an opponent of American independence, being labeled as a loyalist by others had consequences. Female loyalists could be verbally abused or physically harmed, as well as have their property confiscated or destroyed, or even be forced to relocate. Many ultimately moved to new locations like Canada, the Caribbean, and England due to their loyalist associations. Women were often left behind by their husbands, often in the hopes that their presence would protect their property from confiscation, which usually was not the case, or sometimes because they predicted the journey to British lines could be difficult. Thus, they were often on their own to deal with difficult and possibly dangerous situations. Thus, I use this definition when referring to a loyalist woman. Any woman who self-identified as a loyalist or was identified by others as a loyalist and was associated with the British side during and after the American Revolution, an identification that often impacted her post-war life. Now, what was loyalism in Newport like during the American Revolution? Before the American Revolution, Newport was an economically successful port city, and its economic success flowed from its close ties to Great Britain. This painting is a great example of what Newport Harbor would have looked like to the 18th century Newporter. The painting illustrates about a mile of the Newport waterfront in 1740. Agricultural fields are seen in the far distance, wharves and stores crowd the shoreline, and structures such as the Colony House and Trinity Church dot the skyline. In the foreground, a Union Jack flag is flown at Fort George, a reminder of the seaport's place within the British Atlantic world. Ships are actively engaged in the lucrative Atlantic trade, which connected Newport to the Caribbean and West Africa. These trade networks enabled the movement of raw materials such as mahogany and molasses, as well as the forced movement of peoples from West Africa to the Americas. By the time this painting was completed in 1740, Newport was the largest town in Rhode Island and a major player in the Atlantic slave trade. The town was also a hub for a variety of Protestant sects, including Quakers and Baptists, as well as a Sephardic Jewish community that had relocated to Newport. Many colonists came to North America to escape the Anglican Church, but Newport was a site for religious toleration. Trinity Church, a Church of England outpost, was founded here and grew to be one of the larger congregations in town by the 1760s. Newport was tied to the larger British Atlantic world through an international Anglican network as well. This lead up to the American Revolution and the war itself would alter Newport. Some Newporters were among the strongest and earliest patriots, but others had mixed feelings or were against American independence. Newport was tied to Britain politically, religiously, culturally, and economically, and it is important to remember that Newport residents were British subjects. However, Newport's economic success was greatly impacted when 3 warships bombarded the city for a year, starting in the summer of 1775. Many residents on Aquidneck Island left for safer and more economically lucrative locations, and it is estimated that anywhere between 4,000 to 7,000 Newporters departed before the British invaded in 1776. For some Newporters, the arrival of the British Army in December 1776 signaled a possible restoration of its economic pre-bombardment prosperity. Return to British rule and the larger British Atlantic world was welcomed. Even though a war was raging and Newport experienced a major battle in August of 1778, the town returned to some normalcy for Loyalists under the British military occupation. Trade with British ports resumed and Trinity Church reopened. Balls and other social events were hosted, and several Newport women married British officers during this time. Newport became a hub for those loyal to British rule, and Loyalists would flock to and dominate Newport during the 3 years of the occupation. Enslaved people in Newport could also be promised freedom in exchange for their adherence to the British side. However, when the British troops departed Newport, the Patriots retook the town and set policies to punish Loyalists. Some of the most ardent Loyalists went with the British to New York, as did enslaved people who had gained their freedom by joining the British cause. New York was the main base of the British until the end of the war in 1783. The land of those Newport residents who absconded with the troops or had supported the British were confiscated, and over 30 Loyalists were banished from Rhode Island. Some Loyalists left Newport while others remained or later moved back to town. American independence actually hurt Newport's economy more than the stamp tax and other taxes protested in the lead up to the war. Newport's economic downturn and depleted population led Patriots to allow some prominent Loyalists to return to Newport, as migrants were needed to rebuild the town. This was the background that I had coming into my research project. I knew about Loyalist historiography and Newport's role during the American Revolution. There was not a lot of existing scholarship on female Loyalists in Newport. There had been some research done on a few women, such as Mary Gould Almy, whose diary is seen here. She was well known for describing the events of the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778. While Almy's husband was a patriot, she herself was a Loyalist and records this in her writing. Additionally, there was a Newport history article on Henrietta Overing and her first marriage to a British soldier. And in Elaine Forman Crane's epilogue of A Dependent People, she briefly discusses the aftermath of the Revolution in Newport and lists a few Loyalist women. They're briefly mentioned about 2 to 3 pages, but it provided sources for further research. So with this as a starting point, I began searching for Loyalist women in the records. I first looked through the records of the state of Rhode Island, which included petitions to the Rhode Island General Assembly. Loyalist women petitioned for financial assistance or for permission to go to New York to join their husbands. The July 1780 Act listed roughly 30 men who were banished, and I used them to find their wives. I also searched the American Loyalist claims. These claims were submitted to the British government for financial compensation for their losses and services due to their allegiance to Britain. I also looked at a document called the Book of Negroes, which was created in New York City in 1783 that recorded any Black person on a vessel leaving New York, along with details of their former enslavement, escape, and characteristics. The British offered freedom to any enslaved person owned by a patriot who ran away to British lines, and they became known as Black Loyalists. Once I had a list of names, I delved into the NHS archives to learn more about each woman and find any reference about them that I could. NHS holds Trinity Church's records, which I examined to find marriages to British officers or Loyalists, baptism of children, death, etc. I also examined account books, letters, and gravestones. Ultimately, I discovered 70 Newport women that were Loyalists and compiled them into a database. From these 70 women, I began to look for 4 or 5 women to focus on to write an article. I wanted to find women who exemplified the varied experiences of female Loyalists and had enough information on to do a deeper dive. I selected Penelope Honeyman Bessette, who ends up in New Brunswick, Elizabeth Malbone Brise, who leaves for England and returns to Newport, Sarah Brenton Wanton Atherton, who never leaves Newport and remains during and after the war, and formerly enslaved Jemima Bull, who gained freedom by leaving Newport with the British and relocated to New York, Nova Scotia, and possibly Sierra Leone. These 4 women did not leave behind detailed diaries or letters that express their thoughts on loyalism or document accounts of their plights. Nor are there any remaining portraits or images of them, thus I have used random silhouettes with question marks to stand in for their likenesses. However, we can glean a lot about them from what did make it into the archival record. In addition to showing the varied experience of female Loyalists, I also argue that Newport Loyalist women endured hardships because of their connections, as well as Newport's links to the British Atlantic world and their kinship networks within this world. I will now go through each woman individually to explore these connections. To begin with, Penelope Honeyman Bessette, the daughter of James and Elizabeth Honeyman. She was baptized on August 18, 1739 at Newport's Trinity Church. Trinity played a major role in Penelope's life. Her grandfather, James Honeyman, shown here in this print on the right, had been the rector of Trinity Church from 1704 to 1750. On April 25th, 1773, she married the then rector of Trinity Church, George Bessette. Then their only child was baptized at the very same church on May 23rd, 1774, named James Bessette. When American independence was officially declared in July of 1776, the Reverend Bessette closed Trinity until the British arrived in December of that year. The Bessette family stayed in Newport during the British occupation, and the church was reopened. Both Penelope Honeyman Bessette's father, James Honeyman, and her husband were labeled as 4-star or extreme loyalists by Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles was the minister of the Second Congregational Church and librarian at Redwood Library for almost 30 years. He later served as president of Yale College. While he lived in Newport, Stiles recorded very detailed diaries and was an avid patriot. When Newport was occupied by the British, he created a partial list of the inhabitants who remained in Newport. Within the list, Stiles denoted whether someone was a Tory or Loyalist by marking their names with anywhere from 1 to 4 stars. The more stars that Stiles indicated, the more zealous he felt a person was about the Loyalist cause. James Honeyman and George Bessette were each given 4 stars, the highest amount. Trinity Church fared well during the occupation, and the British troops utilized it for services. Penelope's father passed away in 1778 and was buried in Trinity Churchyard. When the British left Newport, George Bessette went with them, leaving behind Penelope and their young son. In June 1780, Penelope petitioned the Rhode Island General Assembly, stating that she was, quote, left by her said husband with 1 child at the time the British troops evacuated Rhode Island, that soon after her household furniture was ordered by the state to be seized, and that she is now destitute of the means of supporting herself and her child, and praying this assembly to grant her permission to go with her child to her said husband at New York, and to carry with her or sell the said household furniture. The General Assembly did indeed return her furniture and allowed her to move to New York with her son. Penelope left Newport and traveled to New York to join her husband. Shortly afterwards, George was officially banished from Rhode Island, which effectively meant that Penelope would not return to Newport ever again. In New York, George worked as a deputy chaplain. In October of 1780, he gave a sermon entitled "Honesty, the Best Policy in the Worst of Times." He had intended to preach the sermon in Newport on the last Sunday before the British evacuated, about the suffering of the Loyalists. He stated that many of the congregation had lost all that is dear in this world, as he surely felt that he and his family had. George Bessette's stance was made clear in this sermon that he believed the British and Loyalists were in the right, and he firmly supported the monarch. It is unknown what Penelope thought of this sermon or the war itself. If she heard or read the sermon after it was published later in London, Penelope Bessette, who had left Newport a disgraced and economically desperate woman, may have reflected on her own circumstances. In 1783, the Bessette family evacuated New York with the rest of the British troops and Loyalists. They traveled to England. The Reverend Bessette submitted a claim to the Loyalist Claims Commission, which reimbursed Loyalists for their losses and services to the Crown. Loyalist claims were one way that being part of the larger British Atlantic world benefited Loyalists. After they were ruined by the British loss in the war, they could still turn to the government for potential financial support. Bessette received a small pension of £50 a year for his loyalty, half of his salary at Trinity Church when he was in Newport. The family resided in Little Chelsea in London while George searched for a new position. Through the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, or the SPG, he was reassigned to a mission in New Brunswick. The SPG was a missionary organization of the Church of England. Once again, Penelope's life was shaped by larger imperial networks. The SPG decided where she and her family would live and offered her husband a salary, providing Penelope's family with economic means. The Reverend Bessette began to prepare to move his family across the Atlantic again to the new province. He submitted another Loyalist claim explaining his position in New Brunswick, but before he could go, he needed money to pay a few small debts and to pay for passage for himself, his wife, and his 12-year-old son. George requested an end to his yearly pension and asked to receive a one-time lump sum. It is unclear whether he was granted his request, but the Bessette family sailed for New Brunswick in the summer of 1786. They relocated to St. John, New Brunswick. Bessette was welcomed and worked to develop the St. John parish, including requesting funds to build a new church. On August 20th, 1788, the cornerstone of Trinity Church was laid in St. John, and a modern photo of that church can be seen on the screen. Unfortunately, George did not live to see that cornerstone ceremony, as he died in March of that year. Penelope was left a widow with a 14-year-old son. On August 18, 1788, Penelope herself turned to the larger British Atlantic World support system of the Loyalist Claims Committee and submitted a Loyalist claim. The claim referred to her inheritance. When her father died, he left a large portion of land to his 4 surviving daughters. Both Penelope and her sister Elizabeth were married to Loyalists who were banished from the state. The Rhode Island General Assembly confiscated their portions of the property in March 1783. However, the confiscation was contested. Penelope's sisters, Catherine Tweedy, Susanna Redwood, and her brother-in-law, Abraham Redwood Jr., petitioned the Assembly in October of 1784. Penelope Bessette's kin network advocated on her behalf when she could no longer return to Newport. The sisters argued that the property had been seized after peace had been declared and confiscation should have ended. The Assembly ruled that the property was indeed confiscated on March 7th, yet hostilities ceased 4 days earlier on March 3rd. Therefore, the estate was restored to the heirs. Penelope received her inheritance despite her Loyalist status, thanks to her sister's persistence and advocacy for her. However, Penelope's share had been damaged by the British while they were in Newport. Thus, Penelope decided to submit her own Loyalist claim in 1788 for her inherited property. In her claim, she explained that she was left destitute and could not afford to repair it. Her claim was read by the Loyalist Claims Committee in London in 1789, but it is unclear whether she received compensation. Penelope continued to be tied to the larger British Atlantic World networks, particularly the Church of England, after her husband's death. She remained in New Brunswick, and her son James went on to become an Anglican minister. James Bessette never married, and Penelope continued to live with him permanently. She outlived her son by a year and died in 1816 in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Her death was announced in the Rhode Island Republican on September 4th, 1816, despite her not having lived in Rhode Island for over 36 years. Elizabeth Malbone Brise was another Newport woman considered to be a Loyalist due to her kinship networks, but she also survived post-war disruption similar to Penelope as well. Elizabeth grew up in a Newport that was deeply connected to Britain. Her parents, Francis and Margaret Malbone, and she was baptized at Trinity Church on August 17, 1755. Elizabeth's father was a prominent merchant in Newport who owned a large home on Thames Street and was able to provide for Elizabeth, her mother, and her siblings because he was involved in various British trade networks throughout the empire. Here is a portrait of her 2 brothers, Francis and Saunders, painted by Gilbert Stuart, which speaks to the family's socioeconomic standing. Unlike Penelope Bessette, who had married before the war, Elizabeth married Major John Brise, a British Army officer, on February 1st, 1778, at Newport's Trinity Church during the British occupation. Elizabeth's husband, John, was the son of an Anglican minister from Hingham, England. The couple welcomed their first child, John Malbone Brise, in December of 1778, while they lived in Newport during the military occupation. With the evacuation of Newport in October of 1779, Major Brise left for New York with the rest of the British Army, but Elizabeth stayed behind. She remained in Newport with her father and young son. Her father, Captain Francis Malbone, had been labeled by Ezra Stiles as a 1-star Loyalist. Although her father had some Loyalist sympathy, his land was not confiscated by the legislature, nor was he banished as the Reverend George Bessette was. The Malbone family continued living in Newport during and after the war. Elizabeth and her husband remained separated until August 1781, when her father petitioned the General Assembly of Rhode Island for permission to bring Elizabeth and her child to New York. The request was approved. Like Penelope, Elizabeth traveled to New York with a young son to reunite with her husband. There, she gave birth to a second child, Francis, the next year. Following the war, the Brise family relocated to John's hometown of Hingham, England for some time. There, Elizabeth delivered their first daughter, Margaret, in 1783. Elizabeth's father died in 1785, but she still had many other relatives who lived in Newport, including her brothers, Francis and Saunders. It is likely that she desired to return to her home. Elizabeth's husband, John, was able to secure the role of British Vice Consul for Rhode Island and was assigned to Newport. Newport's standing in the British Atlantic world made it possible for the Brise family to return to their former home. John Brise was able to move to Newport while maintaining his career in the British government. Unlike Penelope Bessette, the Brise family was able to return to Elizabeth's home in Rhode Island. However, Elizabeth maintained connections to a larger Anglican network, as Penelope did, and when she returned, she resumed a strong connection with Trinity Church. Elizabeth's next child, Saunders, was born in 1785, likely in England, but he was not baptized until 2 years later in 1787 at Newport's Trinity Church. His baptismal sponsors included Melbourne family members. Saunders Brise was then followed by 4 more children, all born in Newport: Mary, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Thomas. Elizabeth's husband, John, died in 1799 and was buried in Trinity Churchyard. Elizabeth's sons became merchants like their grandfather and uncles and helped her survive after her husband's death. From Thomas Brise, her son's letters, we can get a glimpse of Elizabeth's later life. In January 1810, Thomas stated, "I hope that, my dear mother, that you will not deprive yourself of comfort. I advise another mortgage on the house if the Ohio lands be sold." The Ohio lands consisted of land in and around Marietta, Ohio. Elizabeth's husband, John, had purchased 2 shares of the Ohio Company of Newport. After her husband's death, Elizabeth continued to receive money from the investment. However, as time went on, taxes increased and the company would sell stakeholders' shares for payment of assessments and other costs. It is possible that the Brise shares had to be sold for various fees that they could not otherwise pay, and Elizabeth would lose a source of income. Therefore, Thomas recommended an additional mortgage to make up for the loss. Thomas also wrote of sending a significant amount of money, $500 to $600, to his mother and sisters in 1813. From this, it appears that Elizabeth Brise needed financial assistance from her children in her later years. Her son Thomas fought in the Battle of Lake Erie, and Elizabeth did not hear from her youngest child for some time after that. However, she wrote that, "I have been wonderfully carried through many difficulties, and therefore do not despair, but look forward with hope." Elizabeth experienced many hardships during her life. She faced uncertainty after the end of the British occupation and struggled financially at times. However, she always made it through her adversities and expressed an optimistic outlook on life in this letter. She died in Newport in 1832 and was buried alongside her husband in Trinity Churchyard, where all 4 of her daughters were subsequently buried. Unlike Penelope and Elizabeth, presumed loyalists Sarah, Brenton, Wanton, Atherton never left Newport, but she likewise withstood losses due to her loyalist kinship networks and ties to the British Atlantic world. Sarah was baptized in 1751 at Trinity Church, just like the other women, and she was the daughter of Mary and Jaleel Brenton, who was a wealthy landowner and military captain. Unlike Elizabeth Melbourne Brise, who married a British officer, Sarah married a native Rhode Islander, Colonel Joseph Wanton Jr., who was 21 years her senior in 1775. She became stepmother to Wanton's 3 daughters, Polly, Ruth, and Elizabeth, who were from his first marriage to Abigail Honeyman, Penelope Honeyman Bessette's sister, and took over as mistress of Joseph's house on Water Street, today known as Hunter House. Joseph Wanton was a prominent merchant who was wealthy due to his participation in the British Atlantic World Trade Networks. Joseph Wanton had been a lieutenant colonel in the local militia and was involved in the colony's politics, including serving as deputy governor for some time. Joseph began to be perceived as a loyalist. His marriage to Sarah furthered this impression because her brother, Jaleel Brenton, was a publicly declared loyalist. And by 1776, Joseph openly refused to swear an oath to the Patriots. Ultimately, the family was then restricted to their farm in Jamestown and put under house arrest. When the British took Newport, the Wanton family returned to a privileged role in the British Atlantic world and to Hunter House in Newport for the remainder of the occupation. While the British occupied Newport, there was quite a social life in town for officers and women of a certain class. Balls were held often, and Sarah hosted teas and dinner parties for British officers at her home. The Wantons had 3 eligible teenage daughters who would all eventually marry British Army officers and leave Newport. On April 10, 1777, the Newport Gazette reported that Reverend Bessette had married John Morrison and Miss Polly Wanton, eldest daughter of Colonel Wanton. Sarah was pregnant at the time of her stepdaughter's wedding. She would have only one child, Joseph Brenton Wanton. He was baptized at Trinity Church on August 28, 1777. When the British began to evacuate Newport in October of 1779, Joseph Wanton was labeled a four-star loyalist by Ezra Stiles, opted to leave with the troops, as Reverend Bessette had done as well. He left behind Sarah and her 2-year-old son in Newport. He likely hoped that Sarah's presence would prevent seizure of their properties on Cononicut, Gould, and Aquidneck Islands. Sarah utilized her familial networks to survive, borrowing money from her son-in-law, Major Morrison, and from William Wanton, her brother-in-law. Another brother-in-law, Thomas Wickham, who was married to Joseph Wanton's sister, acted as an attorney and agent for Sarah. Her family members were able to partly assist her because of their involvement in the British Atlantic world and Newport's role in it. For example, Major Morrison arrived in Newport with the army, which had been deployed due to the town's strategic and economic importance to Great Britain. His presence in Newport resulted in his marriage to Sarah's stepdaughter. Morrison's pay also came from the British government, providing funds that he then loaned to Sarah. Sarah's husband, Joseph, was banished from Rhode Island, and shortly afterward, he died in New York. It is unclear whether Sarah would have joined her husband in New York if he had lived, just as Penelope and Elizabeth had done. As a widow, Sarah was given more legal power, but her situation was complicated by the Rhode Island General Assembly when they passed an act in October of 1780 dealing with the treatment of widows of banished Loyalist women. The legislation declared that widows of Loyalists were deemed to be forever barred and excluded from any claim of dower onto the estates. Sarah was denied her large dower. However, the Assembly did grant concessions to women who had no other means of support. Sarah would petition the General Assembly 4 times to seek support and rights to her property. The first time was in March 1781. She informed the Assembly that she was destitute and that a large part of her husband's estate was from her marriage portion. She was granted permission to receive the rents from the farms on Cononicut and Gould Islands. Sarah clearly still struggled to sustain for herself and her son, and in October of 1781, she petitioned again. This time, she requested the Assembly allow William Wanton, her Loyalist brother-in-law, to send her some small, trifling articles of clothing and necessaries for the use of herself and her child. The Assembly ruled that money could be sent, but no goods whatsoever. Sarah then petitioned a 3rd time in December of 1781, asking to have the power to appoint the tenant for her farms. The Assembly consented so long as it was approved by the Assembly. In February of 1784, Sarah's brother-in-law, William Wanton, submitted a Loyalist claim for himself and his deceased brother. William claimed Joseph Wanton's Newport house and his other farms. The claim was approved, and in 1786, the British government awarded £1,370. Moreover, 2 years later, the British government offered an additional sum of £1,896. Sarah's Loyalist status rendered her eligible for financial compensation for her losses, due in part to her brother-in-law, who still remained in the British Atlantic world. It is unclear when or if Sarah received her portion of those Loyalist claimed funds. While the Rhode Island General Assembly allowed Sarah to receive rent from her farms, she was still denied her full dower rights. She petitioned a 4th and final time in October of 1784 to receive her right of dower from the part of the estate that had not been disposed of in order to provide for her son's education. The General Assembly agreed to further inquire into it. In the meantime, Sarah remarried in 1784 to a Jamaican planter, William Atherton, who owned at least 2 plantations where enslaved workers grew sugar in Jamaica. Atherton had likely moved to Newport in the 1780s, despite the town's economic downfall, because it still had many trade connections to the larger British Atlantic world. Sarah lived in Newport with her new husband and young son until her death in 1787. Atherton then became the legal guardian of Sarah's son, Joseph Brenton Wanton. Her son spent the rest of his life in England and became an Anglican minister. Our final woman to examine is Jemima Bull, and Jemima Bull's narrative differs vastly from the other women because she was enslaved. Unlike the others, she was not born nor married into loyalism. She had agency in choosing to be a quote-unquote loyalist. However, this choice had nothing to do with allegiance to the British government. Jemima was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time, Newport during the British occupation, and was courageous enough to make a very critical decision for her own life. The other 3 women examined in this presentation were upper-class white women, and their circumstances were unlike Jemima's. They had very large kinship networks, financial resources, and paths to regaining some wealth. Some of their wealth derived from the slave trade, and they also enslaved Black men and women in their households. Jemima had none of these personal resources and only the promise of freedom and passage from the British government. The British Army's occupation of Newport offered her the opportunity to escape from an inhumane and oppressive situation. Furthermore, her experiences in British North America were vastly different from Penelope Honeyman Bessette, who also relocated there. Penelope was the wife of an Anglican rector, while Jemima worked as an indentured servant and still experienced racism and poverty. Jemima chose Loyalism as it allowed her to escape enslavement, thus she is classified as a Loyalist woman, but her story differs greatly from the others. 18th century Newport was a hub for slavery. Not only did many Newport merchants participate in the slave trade, transporting enslaved Africans to the Caribbean as well as North and South America, but Rhode Island also had the highest proportion of Blacks in New England. The 1774 Rhode Island census listed that Black people made up about 13.5% of Newport's overall population. The majority of African and African Americans in Rhode Island at that time were enslaved. Enslaved Africans in Newport often came from West Africa and underwent the harrowing Middle Passage. When they arrived in Newport, they could be sold at wharves or private homes in small-scale transactions. Jemima's birthplace is unknown, but it is possible she was unwillingly transported from Africa or the West Indies and ultimately arrived in Newport to be sold. She was born around 1757. Jemima's enslaver was a Mr. Bull of Newport. Since Henry Bull is the only Mr. Bull in Newport who had at least 3 Blacks living in his home, and Jemima also had 2 younger family members who lived in Newport with her, Philip and Milla, it is most likely that Henry Bull was Jemima Bull's former enslaver. Jemima Bull was part of a group of enslaved people in Rhode Island who chose to become Loyalists during the British occupation, but their loyalism was likely not ideological. For these people, choosing the British side meant freedom from bondage. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the deposed governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation promising freedom to enslaved people in exchange for British military support. Dunmore's statement technically only applied to enslaved people in Virginia, but those in other areas began to flee to British lines. Later, in 1779, the Philipsburg Proclamation officially extended the proclamation to all enslaved people whose enslavers were patriots. As a result, thousands of Black people of all ages and genders sought to take advantage of the proclamation by fleeing to British-held territory to escape enslavement. It did not matter who politically controlled North America, but rather whether enslaved people could achieve their own personal independence. It is possible that Jemima remained in Newport while her enslaver left town, and she subsequently joined the British when they arrived. She may have also escaped from wherever her enslaver relocated and made her way back to British-held Newport. As her enslaver was not a loyalist, the British granted her freedom. This opportunity to escape enslavement occurred because the British troops decided to occupy Newport during the war due to its strategic and economic importance in the British Atlantic world. From the available evidence, it seems that Jemima and her family left Newport with the British Army in October 1779 for New York. She elected to remain in the British Atlantic world as the British government offered her independence. It appears that Jemima and her family remained in New York until the end of the war, when the British were preparing to evacuate New York City. Roughly 3,000 free Blacks were departing New York City for British North America, or modern-day Canada, in 1783. Information about these refugees were recorded in a document called the Book of Negroes. The Book of Negroes noted the name of any Black person on board a vessel, along with the details about his or her enslavement, escape, and physical characteristics. Jemima is listed as a 26-year-old slender wench. She was also in possession of a General Birch certificate, which you can see circled here. General Birch certificates were certificates of freedom given to Blacks living in British-occupied New York City in 1783 by Brigadier General Samuel Birch. These certificates stated that the holder reported to British lines and that they had hereby been declared given permission to go to Nova Scotia, wherever else she or he may think proper. Jemima's family members are also listed beneath her. Philip Bull was 13 and described as a fine boy. It is unclear whether Philip was her son. He may have been a brother or another young enslaved person in the Bull household whom she had taken under her wing. Milla Bull is listed as 6 years old and described as a fine wench. Milla is also marked M for mulatto. It is possible that Milla is Jemima Bull's daughter. Jemima had also given birth to a child after she was free. 1-year-old Caesar Bull is listed under Jemima as well. The 4 members of the Bull family are listed as being in possession of a man named Donald Ross at the time that they boarded the ship the Free Britain, which was bound for Port Roseway, Nova Scotia. Unlike Elizabeth Melbourne Brise, who was able to make choices about the location of her post-war domicile, Jemima Bull, as a formerly enslaved woman, was given only one choice. The British government offered free passage to Nova Scotia, so Jemima and her family moved there. Like Jemima Bull, many Black Loyalists traveled to modern-day Canada. There were also about 1,200 people who came with their white Loyalist enslavers there. The free Black people mainly settled in Nova Scotia, particularly around Port Roseway, now called Shelbourne, and their newly created town to the west called Birchtown. The town was named in honor of Brigadier General Samuel Birch, who granted the certificates of freedom in New York. By the end of the summer of 1783, over 7,900 people lived in the Shelbourne area, with 1,500 free Black people, making up 20% of the population there. In 1784, a muster roll was taken in Birchtown, and Jemima appears on this muster as head of household. It's very difficult to see, so it's transcribed below, but she was listed under Captain Levin John's company. All those in the company were described as late indentured servants to the inhabitants of Shelbourne, who are located on lots at Birchtown. In the muster roll, Philip Bull is listed underneath Jemima as 14 years old, and Millie Bull is listed as 7 years old. Jemima's son Caesar is not listed, and it is possible that the young child died. Black people in British North America dealt with hostility and neglect. Distribution of land grants and provisions were delayed, and when granted, the land was often a smaller amount than given to white settlers, and of lower quality. Many were forced to take on positions as sharecroppers or indentured servants to earn a living, and Jemima again was listed in a company of late indentured servants. In July 1784, the Shelbourne race riots occurred, further reflecting the violence and hostility that the Black Loyalists dealt with. Faced with hostility and violence, many Black Loyalists decided to leave for new British territory of Sierra Leone and West Africa. Black Loyalist Thomas Peters, a former member of the Black Pioneers Regiment of the British Army, traveled to England in 1790 to petition the British government to allow Black Loyalists in British North America to migrate to Sierra Leone. Peters' request was granted, and the Sierra Leone Company arranged for the government to pay the cost of transport from Nova Scotia to Africa. Once again, the British government offered a new life elsewhere in the British Atlantic world, and many took this opportunity. About 2,000 Black people, including over half the population of Birchtown, left Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to sail to Sierra Leone. It is not known whether Jemima Bull and her family traveled there or remained in British North America. Ultimately, the end of the British military occupation of Newport brought about the demise of Loyalist-dominated Newport and caused upheaval for those who had been identified as Loyalists. Status as a Loyalist instantly went from being beneficial to detrimental. Many Loyalists dispersed and temporarily relocated to New York and then to elsewhere in the British Atlantic world. Penelope Honeyman Bessette and Jemima Bull moved to Canada, and Elizabeth Melbourne Brise traveled to England. Others remained in town, like Sarah Brenton, Wanton, Atherton, but still experienced loss of financial support and turmoil. Prominent men were banished, and their wives had to deal with the consequences. Some fled with their husbands, but many were left behind with young children. Loyalist women had to contend with land and furniture confiscation. Moreover, Black Loyalists received their freedom and relocated elsewhere in the British Atlantic world, yet they were still met with racism and hostility. The 4 women this presentation examined reflect the diversity of experiences among Loyalist women. There was no single female Loyalist experience in the aftermath of the American Revolution. Each of the 4 women survived the changes and losses they experienced due to their Loyalist status. Many women could still turn to their familial networks, and female Loyalists found their relationships with their families extremely important. Furthermore, both the women and Newport's connection to the larger British Atlantic world helped them endure. Their links to the Anglican Church, as well as the British government, military, and trade, helped mitigate some of the negative effects. Their stories contribute to a broader and more inclusive understanding of Loyalists. These women did not vote, fight, legislate, or publish tracts, but they were still considered Loyalists and endured the aftermath of Loyalism. And we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Mary-Kate. We do have a question, actually 2 questions from Bob Long. He asks, were Loyalists in Newport also able to evacuate the city at the end of the war? If so, how was this done? Did they travel to New York City, or other locations unlikely, or did the British sail ships directly from Newport to Canada?
So the first answer is yes. So some Newport loyalists, if they decided to leave in October of 1779, when the troops were leaving, they could actually sail directly to New York at that time. Either they could all kind of pull in, like Joseph Wanton, for example, he had his own ship already. So he used that ship to go to New York. And so they would have gone directly there. That's why so many of these Loyalist women, their husbands are in New York because they kind of fled that way. And then over time, if they did decide they wanted to leave, you would have to then petition the General Assembly during the war because you were going to enemy territory. But many women did petition and then get permission to sail directly from Newport to New York. And it's only after the war ends that they're sure they're not going to be able to go back to Newport that they then go to these other places, that they go to England or to New Brunswick.
Bob also asks, was the occupation of Newport any different from any other occupied city by the British? If so, what were the circumstances and how did Loyalists, men and women, interact any differently from Whig men and women in other occupied cities?
So it's quite similar, and if you read Don Johnson's book, actually on occupied America, he kind of takes a look at several of the occupied cities, such as Charleston and Boston and Newport. Um, for Newport, they are a little bit more isolated since it is an island, and then I can just say that they lost a lot of firewood too. That was one big concern, so that the whole island was basically deforested except for trees that bore fruit. So maybe a little bit more of an environmental impact than some other areas, perhaps. I can't speak to the major differences between between the cities. Other than that, it was a prolonged occupation. For example, Boston is only a shorter period, whereas Newport is for 3 years. And so a lot of people in the surrounding areas do come to Newport during that time. And so you get this huge congregation of loyalists just because of that prolonged period. It was a place for them to escape to. Um, as for interacting differently from Whig men and women in other cities, usually people who are the most ardent patriots left. They had an idea that they were coming, and so a lot of people had already left Newport at that time. And so they were either neutrals, people who couldn't afford to leave, or people who were already maybe pro-British anyway. But of course, there are still people who are pro-patriot, some of them acting as spies and things like that remain. But it's pretty similar to other occupied cities' experiences. But yeah, Don
And
Johnson's book, highly recommend.
Susan was wondering, speaking of books, if you could remind us of the titles that you had mentioned earlier in your presentation, and there was one book in particular that you highly recommended. She was wondering about the title of that.
Absolutely. So it's Liberty's Exiles by Maya Jasanoff. It's a little bit of a longer book, but it's a really, really good overview of the kind of diaspora. It's after the American Revolution. It doesn't so much focus on the war, if that's your interest, but afterwards, where did all of these loyalists end up? And they end up in all sorts of places, all the way to India, actually. Benedict Arnold's children end up in India. And it's a really good overview of what happened. Then I also mentioned the Loyalists, grab off my bookshelf, The Consequences of Loyalism, which is just a essays in honor of Robert Calhoun. So it's a bunch of different scholars writing on loyalism. And then I think I also mentioned The Loyal Atlantic, which is another edited volume. That's a good overview. But Liberty's Exiles is a really accessible text. It's long, but it's accessible. It flows like a narrative. So I highly recommend that book.
And Bob has another question. He asks, what was the relationship between these women and their siblings who might not have been loyalists? Were they harassed by Whig women?
Yes. So in Newport, for the most part, those who stayed and were patriot, it seems the 4 women that I particularly examined, they still got along with their siblings. But there are certainly cases. I also studied a woman at Cambridge named Mary Brown Sargent, and she basically gets cut off by her patriot relatives. They kind of stop talking to her. They don't answer any of her letters. So it really was on a case-by-case basis whether your siblings would kind of keep associating with you once you were a loyalist, as was the case for Penelope. Obviously, her siblings were still in contact with her. They were fighting for her to get her property, and so they got along quite well. But there could be a family divide. The American Revolution was indeed a civil war where it did split families depending on what side they chose. Another famous example would be Benjamin Franklin, and then his son, who was a loyalist, and he basically got disinherited. Benjamin Franklin never talked to him again. So case by case basis for families, depending on how they were treated by their siblings. Being harassed by Whig women, I don't have any particular examples of that, especially since when the British are there, they're not going to be very um, vocal about that. But patriot women afterwards could certainly kind of shun people. A lot of them are going to Trinity Church, though, where it's already pretty pro British and they have that kind of social circle that helps them out.
Another question is, what is the last record you have of Jemima's presence in Nova Scotia, and whether there is any indication of whether she left for Sierra Leone?
So the only thing that I found was that her presence in the muster book in 1784. So we find her there. We find her with the two children, not the three. And then I wasn't able to find her on any list going to Sierra Leone, but I also wasn't able to find anything of her in Nova Scotia later on. She also could have gotten married or changed her last name. And so, because Bull is the name of her enslaver, perhaps she's taken on something else later in life. But that's kind of where the trail ends for her at this moment.
Another question is, what sets Loyalist women in Newport apart from Loyalist women in other places? Are the number of Loyalist refugees who ran, usually with nothing, from Newport similar to numbers of refugees from other places?
Overall, I'd say they are similar. I would just say that Newport has a higher number, a much bigger concentration. I did this research for the Newport Historical Society in the summer of 2019, and then I worked with the Cambridge Historical Society in Massachusetts, and I was expecting to find similar numbers, and that was not the case. And I think just the prolonged occupation really led to this congregation of loyalists. People were coming from other places in Rhode Island and Massachusetts to Newport, and it was just a better option to choose to be a loyalist. And so I think a lot of women got put into that boat, as well as you find a lot more people from Rhode Island. In the Book of Negroes, you find a lot of people from the South, but hardly any from Boston or other areas. And I think that's just because the British were there so long that we find this huge amount. Um, but otherwise, it's very similar across the board, where you'll see women getting left behind by their husbands when they're fleeing the Patriots in the hopes that they'll protect their property. They get left with all the children. Usually the property gets confiscated anyway. You see that in Philadelphia, Charleston, Savannah, any of the areas that were briefly occupied and then not occupied again. And then they could be harassed in a similar fashion as well.
We have another question from Philippe. How would you like to see this fantastic research incorporated into the upcoming 250th anniversary of the American Revolution?
I would love Loyalists to be a much bigger part of the upcoming 250th anniversary. I was actually part of a group with Don Johnson and a couple other people like Rebecca Brannon. And I think scholars are definitely determined to have the Loyalists have their say. I think it gives a much more diverse and nuanced view of the American Revolution, instead of this very 1976 bicentennial, where it's very patriotic, obviously. We need to celebrate the founding of the United States, but also it was a much more complicated story than people have told previously. And so I think just adding the Loyalist narrative, especially Loyalist women, because they're often forgot about. You're thinking of people like Benedict Arnold, and things like that. Whereas these women are experiencing kind of the everyday experiences of war, is also something to think about when thinking about the anniversary, and all of the probably events and programming that are going to be coming out. So just adding more and more voices and perspectives to when we think about the American Revolution. Explain.
Well, I have to throw in, since living history is a big initiative of mine, maybe we can recruit you to return in historical attire to represent one or several of these Loyalist women and help bring their stories to life at our living history events. I do see another question that has come in from Bob. Can you tell me the estimated number / percentage of Loyalists who left for Canada, England, the Caribbean islands, India, etc.?
Yes, so the number, which Maya Jasanoff, who wrote Liberty's Exile, she's come up with the most recent estimation, which is probably pretty accurate. It's about 60,000 who left. And then there are certainly Loyalists who stayed and reintegrated, and those numbers are much harder to find. And scholars like Rebecca Brannon are looking into more of the people who stayed. But as for those who left, the number is about 60,000. The majority of them are going to Canada because it's closest, so it's a little bit easier to go. And also you're staying on the same continent, staying a little bit closer to what you know. And then followed by that, there's going to be a bigger number going to then England, and then also to the Caribbean. I see a lot of Southern Loyalists go to the Caribbean because they want to bring their enslaved people with them. And so they could bring, I think, roughly 15,000 enslaved people left with Loyalists as well to go to both Canada and then also to the Caribbean. in addition to the white loyalists who are going. And then for Black loyalists, we see about 3,000 of them going to Canada, and then about I think I want to say about 2,000 go to England. A lot of people were men who had fought for the British end up going to England because they want to go get their pensions, apply for loyalist claims, which unfortunately often Black people did not get loyalist claims. It was very difficult to submit a loyalist claim. You had to have all this paperwork and have people kind of act as references and things like that. And so it would be even lower percentage for Black loyalists who submitted loyalist claims. But yeah, overall 60,000 people.
We have yet another question. Would you say there were more Loyalist women in Newport originally than in Boston when the war started?
That we can find in the record. Yes, I would say there's more in Newport. Does that mean in people's hearts and minds there were more loyalists? Not necessarily. I think people decided on what side. A lot of people were neutral and then decided whether to go patriot or to go loyalists. And you just find people who are very staunchly loyalists. I find them fewer in the Boston area. It's mainly a lot of people coming out of Cambridge or upper class, but I think that's just because Boston was occupied for a shorter time, and then it became this big patriot-dominated place for the rest of the war, whereas Newport held on to it a little bit longer. So yes, in the historical record, I find much more loyalist women than in Boston, but don't know if that's exactly the case of where people's political allegiances fell.
Great. Well, I think that will just about wrap things up. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and just take care.